Welcome to the Exhibitor workshop for Riverside Insights, the publisher of COGAT. Today we're going to take you through several topics on maximizing equitable identification while minimizing time and resources. And the team this afternoon will be led by Dr. Joni Lakin, the author of COGAT Form 8. She's an associate professor at the University of Alabama. And I'm Vickie Driver, Director of Product Management for COGAT, and also joining us is Andy Blanco, our Product Specialist for COGAT. What we're going to talk about today is a quick review of the value of universal screening for equity as a best practice, also how you can use your test results for greater equity and with greater efficiency. And then we'll talk briefly about some tools that'll help you provide equity for English language learners. And we'll follow that up with a live Q&A. Without further ado, here's Dr. Lakin.
Hi, everyone. Today I want to talk about first the universal screening, especially for equity. And you probably know from all of the research that universal screening is one of the best things you can do to increase the equity of your identification process. But at the same time, it doesn't strike everyone as the most efficient way to achieve equity either. So I want to talk about some of the features that will make it, why it's so important and how you can make it more efficient. So first, just to differentiate, so universal screening is in contrast to teacher or parent referral. So any process that begins with nomination would be the nomination or referral led. So it could be a teacher, it could be a parent, or even self-nomination. In contrast, universal screening is some kind of standardized assessment, some kind of consistent, systematic data collection on all students that signals whether students need additional attention through the identification process. Whether you start with referral or screening, the next stage is always some kind of assessment follow-up. So a holistic assessment, a portfolio, the matrix that many states and districts use, something like that, where you're gathering a variety of information, and then ultimately you're making that determination of services and maybe making an IEP, a plan for that student's education. Why is universal screening so important? Well, so here's some data that shows the impact of a school district that moved from referral-based to universal screening. And you can see that overall, universal screening doubled the number of students that they were serving, but also when you look at the number of Black students, they tripled the number of Black students identified, and also tripled the number of Hispanic or Latino students who were identified. So they got a huge benefit from universal screening, and part of this is due to just making it easier for students to qualify. There's no need to know or to have insight into the process to get identified. And it also bypasses some of the biases and obstacles created by the referral process. So universal screening is just really effective for increasing the equity of your program. And when you're thinking about what are your options, so here's where the efficiency part comes in. You have to give some kind of assessment to all of the students, say at one grade level. One possibility is to do the whole holistic review, so the full portfolio or matrix. This would be the most equitable way of doing universal screening. Every student gets full consideration for the program. But this would be crazy resource intensive, so it's not practicable for most school districts, most specialists, to do this level of exploration of every single student in a grade level. So most school districts are looking at one of these other options. One that I hear about quite a lot, people will ask, can I just use the achievement scores? I already have those, very cost effective, no additional testing time. The problem with using achievement scores is that they are particularly influenced by educational quality and access to enrichment and other opportunities. So you're going to maximize the impact of educational quality and inequities on achievement scores. So a better option is some kind of ability test that is less influenced by educational quality. So one would be a short screener ability test. There's a lot of these out there. They benefit equity because you can quickly administer it to all students in a grade level. But it's not as much information as a full portfolio or a full test. And so the fourth option would be something like a full multivariate ability test. So the benefits to equity are that every student gets a thorough consideration, not complete, but still an in-depth consideration. It's kind of a balance of how much resource and time is required. So it's more than a screener, but less than holistic review. And the advantage of using the multi-battery test is that it can then be used for other purposes, such as planning instruction by the regular classroom teacher. So one thing to consider when you're thinking about that initial efficient assessment and the holistic assessment is kind of the connection between the two. So you want to ensure that the confirmation assessment provides new information about students. So you don't just want to retest or give the same kind of assessment right then. You want something that kind of broadens your information about the student, as well as another opportunity to qualify to demonstrate need. But you should know that the weaker the correlation between the screener and the completer or the full score, the full assessment, the more generous you need to be in that first phase, where you want to be very generous with the cutoffs for the placement. So what are some of the opportunities from having multiple scores from a single assessment? So I'm thinking primarily about multidimensional ability test. So if you're going to use a multidimensional ability test, the advantage is that we measure ability, not only general reasoning ability, but also specific types of reasoning skills tied to important academic domains. So with COGAT, we measure verbal, quantitative, and figural reasoning. And these are related to different content types. So verbal battery measures analogies, classification, and sentence completion. And these are different ways that students think meaningfully and critically with verbal information. So likewise, quantitative and nonverbal have 3 measures each that really reflect how a student thinks in that content domain. So you get a lot more information than just the composite score, but the composite score is a very high quality estimate of their ability because it averages across these important domains. So one of the advantages of having battery level scores like BQN is that they have differential predictive strength for different content areas. So here are some average ability achievement correlations from the COGAT standardization data with the Iowa assessments. And what we find is that I've bolded and made big the highest correlation in every column. The best predictor of reading and language and looks like social studies and science achievement is the verbal reasoning battery, whereas Q, but especially QN, so the composite battery of Q and N is a very good predictor of math achievement and to a lesser extent science. So those are ways we can think about using ability tests to predict how students will perform in different content areas. Of course, I get a lot of questions about, what different ability tests should I use for English learners? The irony is you should use the same one. So the best predictors of achievement are the same across groups of students, as far as we've found in many research studies on this issue. When a student is engaged in learning in an English-speaking classroom, understanding their ability to reason and to acquire verbal reasoning, to acquire language through their verbal reasoning is really, really important. So in fact, rather than trying to shy away from any measures of verbal reasoning, it's actually even more important to understand their reasoning skills so that you can plan instruction. And you can see that even for English learners, both Hispanic students who are English learners and non-English learners, they still have the same best predictors of math and reading achievement, which is quantitative and verbal reasoning. Non-verbal reasoning or figural reasoning tests are never the best predictor of these outcomes.
So when we think about the value of a multidimensional assessment like COGAT, it gives us a lot of very useful information, but the challenge with that is it becomes much more complicated to work with all that data. It's like juggling more and more balls in the air. So some of the things that we've been working very hard to do, particularly with COGAT, is to provide ways for you to flexibly and efficiently use your data. One of the things that you may have noticed if you are a current COGAT user who's using reporting through the Data Manager suite is that we've added a new option this year, which is COGAT dashboard reporting. Now, you've always had a lot of flexibility in your reporting, and we haven't taken any of that away. That's still here in the Classic. But if you click through to the COGAT dashboard, on a single screen, we've brought you a whole new set of tools that will enable you to work with your data a little more easily. This is an example of what the new COGAT dashboard looks like. I'm not going to spend a bunch of time telling you about everything on this screen, but we recently did record a webinar about it, which you can find on our website if you're interested to hear in greater detail. When you go to the dashboard, you have several widgets on a single page, and everyone sees this filter bar, which allows you to choose which reporting results you want to see, what grade you want to look at, what content areas. So you could look at all of the COGAT scores, you could look at 1, 2, or 3 of the COGAT scores, as much or as little content as you want to look at. You can also do some parsing by buildings and classrooms if you're interested. And then the first thing that will populate is this distribution graph, which allows you a very quick visual to see how student test results are populating. So for instance, if I'm working on identification, I already know that I may have an extra interest in the students who've shown up in this 9th stay 9 over here. Below this graph, we have a chart that shows how many students fell into each of the stay 9s on each of the scores that we've chosen to look at. I've chosen to look at all 7 of the COGAT scores here, but again, you can choose as many or as few as you want. We also have this score combination tool, and we would like to show you how you can use that to more efficiently parse through your data. So for example, we were just talking about you may want to look at different combinations of scores to take a look at your ELL and your non-ELL students. Well, we've now given you a tool in the COGAT dashboard that will enable you to do analyses like that right at your fingertips. Let's move to a live demo.
Okay, and here is the COGAT dashboard. We're going to show you how to use this score box that Vickie mentioned. Just by clicking on this filter icon here, there are many different ways you can chop up the data here. And let's just say for this example, we like to look at the 95th percentile and above. So I'm going to pull down, for the first part here, I'm going to pull down the complete composite VQN. I'm going to say greater than or equal to, and this is a percentile rank, so we're going to make that 95 in this box here. We run a report, and in this sample data here, we wound up with 7 identified students. But as Dr. Lakin mentioned, you know, maybe we want to look at the individual battery scores. So we can do that. And verbal, and then we're going to, in this Boolean drop-down box here, we're going to pick OR. And what that's going to do is give us a combination of everything that we put here. I'm going to pick quantitative. We're going to make that also 95. And again, greater than equal to. And we're going to add the nonverbal figural battery, greater than or equal to, also 95. And then this is going to, the conditions here are going to be that as long as it's one of these in the 95th percentile or above, they're going to show up in that list. We hit run report. And instead of 7, I've now got 12 total identified students.
Thank you, Andy. So the data manager is really exciting in all these ways that you can use your data more flexibly. So for example, when he was showing the kind of that Boolean logic of the and versus the average, that's a great way of also increasing equity, because if you've seen my 2018 GCQ paper, I talked about how different cut scores are really valuable to identifying a broader range of students. So using that OR rule does always, you know, almost always increase the number of students that are in the pool that you're looking at. And there's also other options such as the QN and the B battery scores that you can use for different purposes as well. So now I want to talk about the screening form, which was new with Form 7, and some folks still don't know about it. So we just want to make sure you know it's there, because it's such an important resource for someone who's interested in efficiency. So the COGAT screening form takes the 3 analogy formats. So picture or verbal analogies, number analogies, and then figure matrices. And it gives your students an opportunity to encounter all very similar formats in their ability test. And the screening form takes less than 1 class period to administer. So we have both the Form 7 and 8 version of the screening form available. Once you've used the screener, then you have the option to use the post-screener or the completer form. And that basically just fills in the other 6 tests that aren't part of the screener and allows you to get the 3 COGAT battery scores that are so useful for planning instruction and for having these flexible identification systems. So it's important to note that if you're administering the test at the level 5, 6 through 8, so that's grades K through 2, the screening form is fully nonverbal as it is. And when you go to the completer, you can choose to omit the sentence completion test, which gives you the alt verbal score. So we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. But you have that option as well. So when you go to the completer, it gives you all the other tests, and then you get the 3 battery scores.
So the screening form and post screener is an option that we have available for folks who are using online testing. And some folks, in the interest of time and efficiency, choose to use the screening form for their universal screening. Now, the full COGAT is also a very powerful tool for universal screening. So we're not advocating the use of the screening form over the full COGAT because you get so much more information and it's so valuable. But we do realize that there are times when you want to administer a shorter test. And so when you do the screening form and you're thinking about students that you want to follow up with, it's very common to use the post screener as your next step in your identification process. Well, it's important to know that the screening form is not perfectly predictive of the full COGAT. It was never intended to be. As Dr. Lakin mentioned, we're only using analogies formats on the screening form, and we have some other types of series and classification items on the full COGAT to help fill out those individual battery scores. If you take a look at the prediction of the screening form total score to the full COGAT VQN composite, the correlation ranges from about 0.88 to about 0.94. And if you know correlation, the most you can get is a 1. So these are very high correlations, but they're not perfect correlations. But what's really interesting is if you take a look at that screening form total score and you start correlating back to the individual battery scores, so correlate that screening form total to the verbal or to the quantitative or to the nonverbal figural reasoning score separately, you're going to find lower correlations across the board, ranging from a 0.71 to about a 0.87. The correlation on the quantitative, for some reason, is the highest one. Why that's important is because these multiple areas in the full COGAT are telling you different things. It's more information than you get from simply a screening form, and it's richer information. And as we just saw with that quick example, looking at the COGAT dashboard, when we're trying to cast a net to find students who might be qualified for acceleration in certain academic areas, we want to consider the full range of abilities that those kids have. So looking at these multi-battery scores is a very good way to catch more kids and catch kids with special abilities. However, the screening form is a quick and reliable initial measure. And when you use that for your universal screening, what you want to do is cast a wide net when you're looking at the group of students that you want to do the follow-up or the post-screener testing with. We recommend that you would nominate about 3 times as many students from your initial screening measure to your secondary identification measure. So say from the screening form to the post-screener, you might want about 3 to 1. If you want to identify 10% of your kids, you do universal screening with 100%, and then you take that top 30% and you move them along into the secondary step. And again, we're going to pause and take a quick look at the tools that we have in the Data Manager suite that enable you to do this efficiently.
Okay, here we are back in the COGAT dashboard. Now, there are a few ways within the data manager system you could get this data. You could do it through the classic, but just for the purposes of this demo, I'm doing this in the dashboard. This is sample screening data. And then as you can see, you just get that 1 point of data. They don't have the individual batteries or the partial composites, just the total score, as Vickie mentioned. And in this case, we want to look at the top, say, 30% of our students. In this sample, we've got 41 students here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to scroll down to the student roster. And this is everybody that took the test. This is their scores. And it's just as simple as sorting by that age percentile rank. I click on this, click on it twice to get top down, and you can just pick the top however many students that you'd like to give the post screener to. Currently, this does not have the ability to download this into a spreadsheet, but it's coming very soon. But as it is, you can send this to a PDF, print it, or however it is you want to access that data later. But there it is.
On the topic of equity, we'd also like to talk about some additional tools that we have in the assessment to help provide greater equity for your English language learners. So one really exciting thing that we've done is we have brought out directions which are offered in several languages for students who are taking the assessment. So we currently have 8 languages live for all levels of the test and all configurations of online testing with audio. Additionally, we have the written directions in English and Spanish for paper testing. So for these other languages, to ensure standardization, we've only offered them in audio because we know that not everybody has fluent Cantonese speakers or Somali speakers available to administer the test. And in fact, these are the languages we've picked up in addition to English and Spanish, Arabic, the 2 most common variants of Chinese, Cantonese and Mandarin, Russian, Somali, and Vietnamese. The reason that we chose these languages is we took a very close look at the educational statistics, and we found, no surprise to anyone, Spanish is by far the predominant home language of most ELL students in the country. However, we've picked up the remaining top languages: Arabic, Chinese, Vietnamese, Somali, and Russian. And as time goes on, if it proves to be a great benefit for folks, we'll hope to add additional languages as well. So I want to give you a quick look at how this works. For the young students, they are hearing the directions through the audio. They never have to read anything, so all directions are read to them. So they hear it from a neutral native speaker in the language. For the older students, we have audio available, but we also have directions that appear on the screen. And in fact, for these upper levels, the other languages are provided for the directions only. We are not able to translate the verbal battery because the construct simply wouldn't hold up. Those scores would not be very meaningful because words are so different in every language. However, it does help the students to understand what they need to do if they can hear the audio or view the directions in their native language on the screen. So you can see here that this is an example for a student in the Arabic variant. So they have the option of English and Arabic directions to appear on the screen. If they simply click this tab for Arabic, they will get to read the directions that tell them how to answer this item in their native language, if that helps. And if they're more proficient at reading English than they are Arabic, they can stay with English or they can toggle back and forth. Well, let me hand it over to Dr. Lakin again.
Thank you, Vickie. So some of the features that were built into Form 7 and 8 were specifically designed to make these tests more accessible to English learners in particular. So one of the things we did was to develop all of the subtests for levels 5, 6 to 8, so that's grades K through 2. With the exception of sentence completion, they are all nonverbal item format. So of course, nonverbal is an administration format, not anything about the content. So we are able to measure verbal reasoning skills with pictures at these younger grade levels where it's more effective. For sentence completion, we actually developed that subtest fully bilingually. So we had both English and Spanish speakers, a variety of Spanish that represents, the predominant dialects in the U.S. And we developed items that were equally difficult in both languages. So for the Spanish-speaking students and English-speaking students, they could take the full battery in that language. And sentence completion, of course, only includes teacher-read prompts for each item. For all other students, that's where the Alt-V comes in. So we can skip that format. I'll talk about that in just a second. But what's important is that for younger students, it's fully nonverbal with the exception of sentence completion. So let's take a look at the formats. So verbals, so you see for the youngest students, we're able to represent complex verbal concepts with pictures. As they get older, you really have to have words to get to those precise meanings that are necessary to measure reasoning. But you can see that with the exception of sentence completion, they're fully nonverbal, and as well as quantitative. We were able to introduce new formats there to measure reasoning skills with these picture-based formats. So just another representation of the alt-verbal scale. So here we're just trying to drive home that the alt-verbal just means that you're dropping the sentence completion. And this is only for the levels 5, 6 through 8. After that, the verbal battery uses written language. So what's great about the alt-verbal is that we are measuring verbal reasoning skills, but the students don't have to have a shared language with the teacher, right? There's no receptive language requirements. They can use whatever language they have in their own mind to reason through those pictures. And what we found was that if you look at the bottom there, we have some data on the proportion of students identified based on the verbal and the alt-verbal scores. And you can see that English learners, they were 5.5% of our standardization population. When we used the full verbal battery, including sentence completion, 3.1% were identified as gifted. And then with alt-verbal, it's 5.4. So we basically achieved the proportional representation using the alt-verbal. And that's really powerful because I mentioned earlier that understanding verbal reasoning skills is really important for English learners because that is such an important task for them, acquiring language, which is a core, something that absolutely requires strong verbal reasoning skills. So some other best practices, local norms. So again, this is one of those trends that's out there. Local norms really are important because you want to compare students to their classmates. So when we're adapting instruction, we should be doing that based on who's in the classroom. We don't really care what students are doing all over the country. That's not as relevant. So we want to use local norms to make better decisions. Another way of doing that is to use opportunity to learn norms. So this would be using program codes, so looking just at English learners, looking at, if your state codes different levels of language proficiency, you could look at that as well, depending on your school size. So there's ways of doing subgroup norms that can further aid you in identifying the most academically talented students within groups. A couple other things you want to keep in mind. One is that you really should provide students an opportunity to practice. So there are free practice tests available to all COGAT users. It doesn't take very long in the classroom, and it takes away any of that unfair advantage from students whose parents have access or the resources to get them any kind of test prep. So if you imagine kind of the learning curve, if you can get the student familiar with the format and ready to take the test, you will kind of erase most of that unfair advantage. And then finally, make sure that your district is using the most up-to-date test, and don't allow outside testing where a psychometrician might be using an out-of-date test or out-of-date norms. So just keep all those in mind when you're thinking about equity for identification. And I will turn it over to Vickie again.
Thanks, Dr. Lakin. So thinking about some of these other kinds of ways that we want to offer equity, whether it's for our English language learners or other groups of students in our schools, we have a variety of tools in the classic COGAT reporting and in the dashboard reporting that will help enable this. One of the best ways to do this is use your student roster report. Now, this is available both in the classic COGAT reporting suite as well as also in the new dashboard reporting suite. Andy showed you an example of how you can use these toggles at the top of each column, depending on what score you want to look at, but you can sort students efficiently. You can also do a combination for yourself by using some of these tools for filtering. So this is a reason why it's a really good practice to use program codes when you're creating rosters or when you are even doing paper testing, bubbling in the program codes for students so that you can tell who your EL students are, you know, which students are in which buildings, and you can use these tools to filter by building. And then, so say you don't want to go to the trouble of offloading your data and creating a set of building local norms, which is something that, again, we have a recorded presentation on our website about how to do that. But let's say that you just want to take a look at a given building within the dashboard and just rank those students, and you can see where your top 10% is in the building. Similarly, you can do the same kind of thing with your subgroups, whether it's ELs, whether it's students who are, let's say you've got a talent pool, a group of students that you're watching and developing. You can put in a code so that you're able to track those students and take a look at how they're doing. Last but not least, we also do offer local norms, although they're based on your entire test event. So if you've done universal screening, say all your second graders, you've opted for local norms, this is another one of the scores that's going to populate in your data manager reporting, and you are able to pull that into the Boolean logic. You're able to use that on these roster reports, and you can simply use your local norms for your test event here and sort the students based on the local norms as well. So we have a variety of really interesting and efficient tools for you to use to make it easier to get through your data and get the greatest value out of the testing that you've done. If you're interested for more information on any of these topics, we have a whole suite of resources for you that are available. The best way to find this stuff, check into our riversideinsights.com website. So for one, we have upcoming webinars and events. We also have our blog, and you'll want to take a look at some of our recent blog posts, including we have the one about the new dashboard. I believe we have one about doing additional analyses with local norms. We also have a section on our website for back to school resources. And we have a place here that you can tell us what other kinds of tools that you need or what questions that you have. So we'd love to hear from you on our website or comments on one of our blog posts. In our Back to School Resource Hub, we also have all the resources that you need. If you click here, you go through to the Back to School Resources Hub, all the tools that you need to take a look at remote proctoring. Additionally, I believe we've done a blog post and we may have done a webinar about this, but we have a whole suite of tools and information that you can access by going here on our website. So we'd love to hear from you, and actually keeping that in mind, we'd like
Before I cut myself off, I think what I meant to say there is we'd love to hear from you now. It's a bit of a one-way channel of communication because we only have the Q&A or chat panels to hear from you. But Dr. Lakin and Andy and I are here. And the slide on the screen also shows you that we will be holding quote unquote booth hours in our virtual booth, which is to say we will be available for one-on-one conversations several times over the next few days. So for instance, we had a question from one person who asked if the slides were available, and we can certainly make the slides available to you in a PDF. The easiest way to do that is going to be for you to interact with us at the booth and make sure that we can get you a PDF of those slides, because I'm not 100% sure that I'm going to get a registration list of everybody who was on the call today. If we do get that, we can send it out to everyone who was on the call. NAGC says, oh, yes, you will. So good. We can follow up with an email to all of you and send you a copy of our slides in a PDF version. As well as this recording is going to be hanging around on the NAGC site for the next 6 months. So heaven forbid you can watch it again. Anyway, I was having a conversation with one person while the presentation was going on. So this is a school group that is interested. They're currently using the KBIT, which is the Kaufman Brief Intelligence Test. And they're using that as one of their screening measures, and they were interested to know exactly how that compares to COGAT. Now, I'm not aware, Joni, that we have head-to-head comparison data with the KBIT, but is there something you'd like to weigh in on there?
Sure. Yeah. So the KBIT, right in the title, it's very brief. It only gives you limited information about a student's overall ability. So it doesn't give you the VQN nuance that COGAT does. So, this person was asking about kind of the pitch to their administrators. And part of it is, the KBIT's individually administered and can be kind of onerous to administer. So what's nice is that, COGAT can be online or group administered, but also you have all that value from the 3 different batteries. So if you talk to your administrator about the regular classroom use, how, all teachers could use this information to better provide instruction to their students, I think that the cost benefit equation is a lot more in COGAT's favor. We don't have head-to-head data with KBIT. It's not very commonly used in the same spaces as COGAT. But there are some other pieces of information, especially in the score interpretation guide, about identification with COGAT that may be useful. Do we want to point them to the YouTube? Because we have a couple of videos about kind of pitching or what you need to know about COGAT. So that might be another good resource, is the Riverside YouTube site.
Oh, yeah. Well, we have all kinds of information out there. Yeah. Thanks, Andy. Well, while that came up, there's a really fun question I want to get to in a minute. But while that came up, someone also asked, what about a comparison to SAGES? And again, SAGES is one that I'm just not as familiar with. It's not as commonly used.
It's not widely used. In fact, I'm going to Google it.
I think it's a combination of aptitude and achievement. So it's not purely one or the other. But I don't know as much about this instrument.
No, I don't know very much about that one either.
All right, well.
So again, it says it has a composite score for reasoning ability and general ability. Not really sure how they differentiate those two, since those are synonymous in theories. But it does sound like that would be a brief screener. So, the COGAT screener, is briefly administered. It's probably fairly equivalent in terms of that general component. It's really the 3 batteries, the differentiation there. That's the real value from the full COGAT.
Yeah, so I think you're doing what I'm doing, which is Googling madly, even as we're speaking. But so an interesting thing about the SAGES is that it has a nonverbal reasoning. So in other words, a figural reasoning component. And then it's got a language arts social studies component. So that's going to be heavily weighted by education and opportunity. And then there's verbal reasoning, which without taking a closer look at it, I can't really weigh in on that one. It's probably pretty language weighted though, specific language weighted. And then a mathematics science section, which again is, that's an achievement piece. So while we do advocate for multiple measures, and certainly including both achievement and ability as part of what you look at, I'm not sure that we'd advocate doing it in a single instrument. But now you've given us an assignment and we have to get more familiar with SAGES.
Everyone's welcome to come to the booth.
So a question came in that I love, because this is something that you and I have actually been talking about, writing a cognitively speaking about this, Joni, which is it possible to administer COGAT to students as an above grade level test?
Yes.
So go.
So short answer, yes. Long answer. I mean, you can do anything. It doesn't make it a good idea, to quote Chris Rock. So there are some pros and cons. So if you have a student who is very highly able and you're concerned about a ceiling. So one thing is that COGAT is built for that. So a lot of times we get questions about this from people who are using out of level achievement test. And since achievement tests are targeted to the grade level, they can be very narrow. And especially if you're talking about the state achievement test and you still have a proficiency focus, it will not have enough ceiling to differentiate your very highly able students and high performing students. Ability tests are different. They're designed to the variability of students. So there's not a low ceiling. It goes up to 160, the IQ-like scale. So there's a lot of ceiling built in because we know that very bright students are taking the test and that people want to be able to differentiate at that level. So that makes it different from achievement test. Now, if you have a very high performing student and you still feel like IQ 160 might be, a ceiling to them, you could go up one level, and that might give you a little more variability to detect differences between students. Unlike achievement test, you don't want to jump a bunch of grade levels. So if you think a student is, has the academic ability of a 6th grader in 3rd grade, you don't need to give them the 6th grade test to assess that, because the content doesn't change, the what they're reasoning about doesn't change meaningfully across grade levels. Like, you're learning fractions in 3rd grade, you're not learning fractions, you're learning, pre-algebra in 6th grade. Abilities are more general than that. So you don't need to go that far out. And Vickie, you probably want to weigh in on the technicality of this, but you can actually it can backfire and you can create a pseudo ceiling effect if you go 2 or more levels out, because it basically puts them on a scale where we're extrapolating. And so you'll get, students actually will get, well, Vickie, you tell us the finer points of that.
Well, right. So there's a couple of ways I want to add context around this. So just to continue on to the part that you were talking about. So for instance, the Bell and Blanc group at the University of Iowa has the Iowa Acceleration Scale. So even though it comes from the University of Iowa and it sounds like it's related to the Iowa test, it's actually not specifically. What they're talking about is testing students for consideration of skipping grades. So actual acceleration across grades, skipping from 3rd straight to 5th or whatever. And the thing that they recommend when you're testing kids out of level in a scenario like that is, I am testing this 3rd grade student who happens to be 8 years old today, and I am looking to put him or her into 5th grade. And so what they suggest that you do is go ahead and give him or her that 5th grade level test, but then evaluate his or her scores against 5th graders. So take a look at the 5th grade norms for that student, not just the 3rd grade norms, to understand how he or she would do in the context of 5th grade. And the other super important piece about this, when you're working with COGAT or any age scaled assessment, is when you look at that standard age score, you then also need to make a conversion and say, well, this is how this kid looks relative to 3rd graders at age 8. But now let me take a look at the age scale scores for this student if he or she were 10 years old, which this is the group of kids we're going to be throwing this kid in with. So those are pretty important interpretations that you need to make when you test off level. One of the things that I hear really commonly is folks think, well, I'm testing for gifted and talented identification. I'm going to give my 3rd graders the 4th grade test because it's harder. But when you're continuing to scale that student using their actual age at the time of testing in grade 3, which is the age you should be using in most cases, you're not actually giving them a harder test, because we expect a 3rd grader, even on reasoning ability, not to get as many items correct as a 4th grader. So I'm going to give this kid a 4th grade level test, But implicit in the expectations for third graders is they're not going to get as many items correct. So when you start off level testing and you continue to interpret that student at the age and grade that they currently are, as Joni said, you're throwing kind of a false ceiling into it. Certainly for 1 or 2 grade levels off level with COGAT, it works fine. But when you get more than 2 grade levels away, it starts to get wacky. So let me give you the wackiest example that I can. If I take a kindergarten student, age 5 or 6, and I give that student the high school level, the level 17, 18 of COGAT, that student could go through and guess and get every 4th item right. So the law of averages say, you know, if I guess, I'm going to maybe get every 4th item right. And that would, for a kid who's age 5, that would put him or her in the 99th percentile, just guessing on that high school level of the test, because it's so off level. Yes, it's a harder test, but I don't expect a 5-year-old to be able to do very well on that test. So I'm giving you an extreme example, but it really does start to throw the scores off. Say, for instance, if you're testing 3rd graders and you're giving them the 6th grade level of the test, but you're evaluating them as 3rd graders. So unless you're following kind of that bell and blank example for acceleration, where you're taking a student who's 8 and you're evaluating him or her in the context of being a 10-year-old, because you're going to ask him or her to perform with 10-year-old peers, it doesn't necessarily do what you think it does when you test off level. The one other thing that I would encourage you to think about is that the most often tested level for COGAT is the 2nd grade level, or level 8. And between level 8 and level 9 is where we have that shift in content from the picture-based items over to the word-based items. And that could be an important consideration for your programming. So if you are considering students to put them into an advanced ELA program, then you probably do want to measure them with English language words. But if you're looking at your ELs and you want to give them the best opportunity that you can give them when they're in 2nd grade, I would encourage you that probably staying on level with that 2nd grade version with the picture-based items is probably the way to go. And in that context as well, you can even give that level 8 to a 3rd grade student, and he or she can still, because there's so much ceiling in the instrument, can still score high enough to be qualified for advanced academics. Okay, so the person came back and said, if I test that 3rd grader with the 5th grade COGAT, do you provide a report to allow us to compare results to 5th graders? So there's 2 ways to do that. You can roster that student as a 5th grader when you test him or her. And the scores that you get back are going to be 5th grade scores. Or you can roster him or her in the grade level that they're in today, which is 3rd grade level. And then you pull that norms and score conversions guide out of Data Manager, and you can take a look at the 5th grade norms. So you use the universal scale score, you do a 5th grade lookup, and then you also, if you're going to do an age lookup, you use that universal scale score and you reinterpret that student's age. So for instance, instead of looking at them as an 8-year-old, which is the age they were when they were tested, you want to look at them relative to 10-year-olds. Those are all conversions that you can make real easily with the norms and score conversions guide. Let's see, those are kind of the questions that we've had come in today. We have about 10 more minutes if anybody has anything else.
So I wanted to go back real quick to
Yeah.
questions about KBIT and SAGES. I haven't done all the research or anything. I don't have answers specifically about those, but I do want to draw your attention to, people calling different things by the same name. I don't remember if that's jingle or jangle. But one of the things we see, so like with SAGES, Vickie was saying that it looked like one of the scales was figural formats, so with pictures. but they call it reasoning ability, right? Sometimes we have definitions that are the actual items are narrower than the names suggest. But on verbal, we kind of have the other problem where, with COGAT, if you look at our item formats, especially at the lower levels, we have all picture-based formats. So they're doing reasoning, they're not reading long prompts or listening to long prompts. Even as you go into older students, the most reading intensive question is one longish sentence or a couple of shorter sentences on the sentence completion. Everything else is single words. And the way we build the verbal battery for COGAT is really different from the way a lot of these other tests build verbal batteries. So, and looking at some like practice tests that people have posted for these other two, they're very verbally loaded. So, if you have like a reading comprehension task, it'll be a whole paragraph to read and to make sense of. And that is so much more achievement loaded than the way that we approach verbal reasoning. So we look at Loman always, when we're writing the items, right? Loman always coaches. He's like, we want to use very fine understandings of common words. So we're not like the SAT and GRE where we use, crazy words. And if you happen to know it, you're really lucky. We use very common words in very precise ways. And that is the core of what it means to reason verbally is, kids with strong verbal skills do have a wide vocabulary very often. But what's more important is they understand the nuance of words. And when they read, they understand the nuance of how it's being used. And so our tests are less verbally loaded. They have less of that reading comprehension load than a lot of verbal batteries. So if I was talking to an administrator again about what's different, is COGAT is very much focused on the reasoning skills, the critical thinking skills. Anything related to like reading comprehension and achievement, that's for a separate test. So we're very focused on what we're trying to do, not trying to do everything, but measuring the core of verbal and quantitative and figural reasoning that uniquely helps us understand students' readiness to learn. So end of speech. That's something I wanted to point out. Not all verbal is verbal in the same way.
Well, and not all nonverbal is nonverbal either. So yes.
Speaking of soapboxes, yeah.
Yeah.
Nonverbal is an administration. It's not an item format.
Exactly. So we don't, oh wait, something just popped up. Something just popped up. Okay, I hear more and more critiques, and I'm reading this live. I hear more critiques of analogies for measuring verbal reasoning. What are the best measures of verbal reasoning? What are emerging measures?
Yeah, so I'd be very curious to see the critiques. So a lot of the critiques are based on perceptions that things like the SAT or the GRE don't predict anything, or they're just esoteric knowledge. Analogies are really great measures of reasoning skills. So I would be curious to see what the evidence was there. But yeah, the public critiques that you see are not based on the psychometric evidence. What we know from the literature on intelligence research and predictors of academic outcomes. My understanding of that literature is that analogies are really good at measuring that. So it can be an issue of kind of perception and face validity more than the reality. But if you're, I see we have a few folks I know from the research community. So if you're basing this on some evidence, some empirical evidence, feel free to shoot it to me because I would be very interested. In terms of emerging measures, we're always looking at new opportunities, but hasn't been a lot of invented in the verbal domain in a long time.
Well, one thing I'd like to add to the conversation about analogies is that specifically, so we have the full COGAT with the 3 separate battery scores and all the subcomposites, composites and subcomposites. And then we have the short version, which Joni mentioned, which is the screening form, which uses the 3 analogies subtests from the different sections of the test. So we use the verbal analogies subtest, we use the quantitative analogies, and then we use the figure matrices, which in essence is figural analogies. And that was done specifically for 2 reasons. And Joni, that's really your pitch. I'll let you give that one.
Oh, I started typing an answer to someone. I'm sorry. What was the pitch I'm supposed to give?
Choosing the analogies format. So you did that to minimize task switching, but also because analogies are so powerful.
Right. Yeah. So when we were looking at building the screener, that was the conversation we had was, I was looking at them and thinking, which ones are the most intriguing or interesting to students. But, if you have to pick just one measure, analogies are a very good way of measuring reasoning, and they do adapt. So we were able to do verbal and quantitative and figural analogies. And yeah, like you said, it reduces the task switching, which is a big deal for younger kids.
So we're going to have to move to warp speed. We've had 3 questions come up and we only have 4 minutes left, and it is a hard stop.
Why don't you answer the question about local norms and non-US norms?
Yeah, so, okay, well, to the person who asked, can you test any time of year? You absolutely can. We're always scoring kids relative to the age they are when they test. So feel free to test any time of year. Smallest group size for calculating local norms. Oh my God, there's not a right answer to that one. There is not a right answer to that one. So if you have a lot of students, you could have 100 kids and they could all have almost the same score, and local norms are going to tell you nothing. So what's more important about your group is that it has some variability in it. If you have a small group of students, just like an individual class of students, the easiest thing to do is kind of just go into your roster report and just rank them. Don't even go through the calculation of figuring out what the mean and standard deviation are to calculate a normative distribution. That's the way we do it on a larger distribution, because we truly want to understand all the variability, as well as, where the center of that distribution is and what the shape of that distribution is. But when you have 10 kids, 15 kids, 30 kids, and you just want to know who the top performers are, sometimes it's just easier to put the scores in order and say, here are my top 10 kids. There just is not a single answer to that one.
I would say Vickie's #1 answer is export your data and do it in Excel, right? That's always
well, and we did a little
we did
a little webinar on that. Doing it in Excel is so easy. It takes 3 function keys. It really is very easy to do. We had a question for norms for students outside the United States. Now, we actually run a large testing program in Canada, and they do use their own norms in Canada. We test a lot of students in American schools around the world. Those folks usually use the US norms. And we are working with some large programs overseas in different regions and countries of the world where they are developing norms locally. Yeah, I just got my 2-minute warning here. But in terms of published norms and in the US, we only publish US-based norms for the testing that you would do in the US. And we do not, at this time, include Canadian or other international or foreign students unless they're in a US school in our data set for norms at this time. However, we will give you local norms on your test event, and you can always calculate local norms and use your own data export to start creating a robust set of local norms, whether it's just for your school district, if you happen to be in a different region of the world. I mean, it's very easy to start compiling that for yourself. I don't know that that was a great answer, but that was the answer. Are norms being developed for Australia? I'm going to be on the phone with Australia in 2 hours. Check with me. Check with me at our office hours through the weekend, and I'll let you know what I learn. I'm not sure whether they're doing their own norms or not, but we do have a large program in Australia. Joni's got a session on Monday afternoon at 2:15 Eastern time. We will be in the booth. We're keeping some hours every single day throughout next Tuesday. So please follow up with us if you have additional concerns or questions. And thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Thank you.